Our topic this afternoon, I want to talk about Henri Nouwen, as you have on your sheet there, a saint for the complex. A complex, anguished genius, the complex, anguished genius and depth of an artist. And again, like yesterday, I want to begin with an apology. The apology is that this is a delicate topic. You know, whenever you're talking about somebody else's unwholeness, somebody else's struggle, you better wade in there very, very gently and very, very carefully, and so on. So it's a delicate topic, and yet, I mean, it's always there. It needs to be addressed, and so on. And I want to approach it this way. I want to approach it through Henri Nouwen as an artist. And that's a much safer approach, because there you'll see so many parallels between him and other artists and performers, and so on. So it's a much safer approach than approaching it psychologically, or even at times spiritually. So I'm going to try to work Nouwen's wound and what it is, but I want to do it through the approach of like the tortured, the complex kind of genius of the artist. And I want to do four things with you on the sheet. I want to talk a little bit about Nouwen as a struggling artist, but who's a faith-filled genius at the same time. Struggling artist, but a person with a deep faith and a genius at the same time. Then I want to do a little insert just about our universal struggle. We all struggle. You know, that the problems that Nouwen has and the reason why we identify with him, we all have those same struggles. And so I want to talk a little bit about the universal struggle with kind of the deepest energy that's inside of us. And then I want to talk a little bit about, a little more than a little bit, to be the essence of the talk, the heightened struggle of the artist, which includes Nouwen. And then I want to, at the end, say a synthesis, the synthesis and gift of that was Henri Nouwen. Henri Nouwen is a synthesis of faith and the artist who became a great gift for us. And as was just said, you can be a powerfully struggling person and be a saint. And that's why he means so much to us. So let's begin a little bit with, and I want to begin with what I call, as yesterday, a hermeneutical key. Always a story or two. I want you to have in the back of your mind as we sort this thing through. The struggle of the artist. Some years ago, I was watching a television interview with Janis Joplin, the rock star, who, like many rock stars, died young, like Michael Jackson and Amy Winehouse and Prince and on and so on. And someone said to her, "What's it like being a rock star? You're on stage and you're this rock star." And as Janis Joplin said, it's really hard. Said anybody who hasn't been there has no idea what this is like. Said, can you imagine what it's like to go out on a stage and make love to 20,000 people and then to go home and try to sleep alone or to sleep at all? No, he said, can you imagine what it's like to drink in this kind of energy from 20,000 people, then you go home and try to sleep alone or to try to sleep at all? First story. I'll come back with that. Second story, but concerns Paul Tillich. You know, Paul Tillich was one of the great theologians of the last century. He was a married man, Lutheran, Chicago, originally in Germany, then Chicago. And when he died, and after he died, Time magazine came out with these revelations that it turns out that Paul Tillich had a girlfriend in virtually every city in the world. And it was this big scandal, it was this theologian and so on. Well, some years later, Rollo May, the great psychologist, wrote a very fine book on Paul Tillich called simply My Friend Paulus. And in the book, he takes up the chapter on Paul. And he said, first of all, he says, people conclude very quickly, he said, that Paul Tillich had a girlfriend in every city on earth. He said, that goes without saying. He said, doesn't mean he slept with those women. You know, he said, Paul loved people. He was an artist, theologian. He said, so he had all these friends. He said, but more importantly, he said, I was a close friend of Paul's. He says, he sat with me many hours agonizing about this and talking about how he felt emotionally unfaithful to his wife, even though he wasn't sleeping with these women. He said, I always feel like him. He said, and I can't help myself. He said, I love all these people. And he said, hang on to this little clip. At the end, he said, I should have never been married. He said, I have too much eros to ever be married. He said, I should have been a Roman Catholic celibate. That would have been a perfect occupation for me. Because if you can't sleep with everybody, you shouldn't sleep with anybody. Okay. Now, those aren't just two throwaway stories. I want you to keep them back of the mind. Henri Nouwen. Henri Nouwen was an artist. He was a Roman Catholic celibate, and so on. Keep those in mind. So let's begin with him as a genius born of anguish. Of course, I stole that title from Michael Higgins, who I wish was here today, but Michael Higgins, his initial book on Nouwen, there'll be some fuller books called Genius Born of Anguish. And you notice that there's a great paradox in there. He was a genius, but the genius was very much born of anguish. Okay, I want to first of all talk about the anguish, and that's been talked about a lot. You know, that he was a man who was congenitally restless, never quite felt at home in this life. He always said, I don't know if life always welcomes me. The outsider, just not fully welcomed and so on. And then a bundle of contradictions inside of himself, as you saw, as Esther was saying yesterday. He goes to the monastery for solitude, but then he's checking his mailbox every 8 minutes to see whether somebody's writing to him from the outside, He's seeking solitude, but he isn't, and so on. And then his neediness. And some of you were his friends, and I only have the second hand, but that he was a very needy man, He demanded that his friends love him. And if you didn't, he'd tell you about it, and so on. Okay. And then lastly, he had the hypersensitivity of an artist. I'll talk about that. Most artists, that's what makes them great artists. They have a hypersensitivity. They're just so finely attuned, partly to their own soul and to certain creative energies, that it makes ordinary living difficult. And you see it in your rock stars and so on, and they're killing themselves all the time. That's not an accident, and so on. So that he's got this hypersensitivity, which is wonderful to write deep books. It crucifies you in life. Like he said the other day, he said, I could give a talk, he said, and 1,000 people would adulate me. One person says, you stink. He's only got to remember the one. He's only got to remember the rejection, and so on. Okay, now, that's the tortured part, the anguished part. On the other side, he was a real genius. Many people are anguished, but they're not a genius. Okay, no, and that just needs to be. Nouwen was a spiritual, psychological genius. And a lot of clinical psychologists with high training psychiatrists can only envy his natural insight into the human soul and into the human spirit. Not only was he a natural genius, he had the natural faith of a mystic. Notice, he was a deeply faith-filled man. He never struggled, and his whole thing about the beloved and so on, he struggled to appropriate that existentially, but he never struggled. He was a natural mystic at the same time with this kind of tortured complexity that he had. Now, that's the first point. Now, he struggled with deep energy. I want to first of all talk about our universal struggle. One of the reasons we all relate to Henri Nouwen, we all struggle like this. Some of us more, some of us less. And probably if you're a sensitive person, you struggle pretty deeply with those same energies. But I want to name those energies. And the energies come from what's deepest and best inside of us. We believe that we're made in the image and likeness of God. In our Judeo-Christian tradition, that is the deepest thing inside of all of us. But we have a powerful naivete about that. We're made in the image and likeness of God. So somehow we fantasize naively that there's some kind of beautiful icon of the Trinity that's stamped inside of your soul, and you have God's image and likeness inside of you. Don't think that's true too. But God is fire. God is energy. In the Old Testament, God is fire. You wake up in your crib and you're on fire, and you're going to be on fire for the rest of your life. St. Augustine, you've made our hearts for yourself, Lord. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So we're in fire. There's divine fire inside of us, so that put it in street language, inside of each of us, there's a little god or a little goddess. And they're not going to make easy peace with this planet. You're always longing for something more. It's never enough, and on and on and on. Remember that beautiful text in Ecclesiastes, which you all know by heart. That beautiful text where the author of Ecclesiastes says, there's a season. There's a season for everything. Time to be born, time to die, a time to gather stones, a time to throw stones. I don't know what that's all about anyway. A time to plant, a time to harvest, and so on. And we always keep reading that to students. That there's a time for war, a time for peace. Don't put the book down. Then he's making his point. He says, God has made everything beautiful in its own time, but God has put timelessness into the human heart so that the human heart is out of sync with the seasons from beginning to end. See, nature has this beautiful rhythm, spring, summer, winter, fall, so on. And, people give birth to babies and they grow up and they give birth to babies in the cycle of life and the circle of life, and it's all beautiful, except that you've never fit in. From the time you were born and woke up crying in your crib, you've been out of sync with that. Notice one of Nouwen's things is, I'm always out of sync. I want to think, I don't know if this world is welcoming me. I don't know if I belong here. Who loves me? I know I'm God's beloved, and so on. See, we're out of sync. I used to tell my students, the difference between humans and animals? I said, cattle contentedly munch grass in pastures, and human beings discontentedly smoke grass in bars. Okay. And in that you get the difference. Now, Nouwen didn't discontentedly smoke grass in bars, but I'm sure he was very tempted. See, we have this powerful fire inside of us, and we're very naive about it, See, it is the source of all that's highest, of all that's most noble, of all that's sublime in us. But it's also the source of all of our discontents. It's the source of all of our addictions. It's the source of all of our obsessions. What's wrong with us is not just what happened with original sin. What's wrong with us is what's most powerfully right with us. God made you with divinity inside of you. And this divinity doesn't make easy peace on this planet. And you're going to see artists and stuff, they simply inflame that, and it drives them into great creativity. It also drives many into madness and into other things and so on. See, so we have these simplistic notions. I want to add one other thing. We also have a very simplistic notion then about ego. See, in our spiritual language and so on, ego is a bad thing, Well, it isn't. If you're going to accomplish anything in this life, you need a big ego. Doesn't mean you have to be egotistical. That's something different. Let me talk about that. I'm going to ask you a question. I don't mean this as an irreverent question at all. Okay. Mother Teresa, did she have a big ego? The size of the Grand Canyon. But she wasn't an egotist. See, Mother Teresa could walk into any room in the world and say, no, I'm a very important spiritual figure. I'm a gifted person from God. And she was right. I'm God's beloved. Now, she wasn't an egotist because she'd also say, but this is not me. And this is God. See, the rock stars sometimes have big egos, but they don't say this is about God, this is about me. And you're going to see part of the struggle with artists is to disidentify from the energy. See, great people, and to do anything great in this world, you better have it. First of all, your ego, stops you from being psychotic. You have to have a strong ego just to be sane, okay? But also, you have to have a strong ego to ever do anything of magnitude. John Paul used to stand in front of the whole world and says, I love you, and it's very important you hear this from me. You couldn't do that, your tongue would break off. You'd say, well, who am I to stand in front of the whole world and say, I love you, and so on, well, I'm not the Pope, and so on. No, see, he had a huge ego, but he wasn't an egotist. He said, no, but this is God. I'm just God's instrument. Henry could kind of do that, but with some struggles and so on. See, okay. And see, so that we have this over-pious notion about ego, and I'm going to flesh that out and what that means with the artists and so on. And then the last thing is that we have this pious and naive notion that these deep energies are friendly. They aren't. They kill you. In fact, that's the great conservative strength and the great liberal naivete. Liberals and conservatives have different strengths than naivete. Liberal Liberals are naive about energy. They say, just don't fear it, just open it up. And no. That's where conservatives always say, when conservatives say careful, careful, and careful, I once heard a liberal speaker, wonderful woman, this wasn't a wonderful statement, and she was talking about the church. She said, the churches have always been far too uptight about sexuality, which is true, But then she adds, says, who's ever been hurt by it anyway? Hello? The better question was, who hasn't been? There's been more heartbreaks and murders and suicides and so on. It's a powerful, godly, great energy. But be careful with it. See, and oftentimes you're going to see artists die and so on because they're not careful enough with the energy. That energy will kill you. It'll kill you in different ways and so on. Now, see, that's a struggle for all of us. And as I say on the sheet there for you, then you're going to struggle with four things. The struggle, I'm going to tease that out in a second. The struggle between grandiosity and depression, then the struggle with narcissism, and the struggle with rage, and the struggle with boredom. All of those four come from the image and likeness of God inside of us. So the image and likeness of God, that's divine energy, divine fire inside of all of us, and it knocks us around the planet, but it also, all the greatness and all the altruism and everything we can do comes out of that same energy. Okay. But it's going to lead us into deep struggles with grandiosity and depression, with narcissism, with rage, with boredom. Now, that's true for all of us. I want to put this more into artists struggle with that in a special way because it becomes heightened inside of them. See, if I'm just a normal guy and I can have 3 beers at night and watch the basketball game last night, I'm going to sleep pretty well. Okay. Artists don't always sleep that well. Now, let's look. There's 4 interpenetrating ways that this is heightened inside of artists, and it goes without saying, heightened inside of Henri Nouwen. And the first is the struggle to remain normal and balanced given the creative process. Part of the reason that most of us in this room aren't ever going to be great artists is because we're just too sane and we're just too normal. And that's the greatest thing in your life, and it's going to keep you from ever writing the great novel or doing the great musical piece or whatever. Let me give you some examples. Nikos Kazantzakis, the great Greek writer, wrote Zorba the Greek, and all his books. The Last Temptation of Christ, which incidentally, whatever you thought of the movie, that's a powerful, powerful book. It's a powerful spiritual book. It's meant to be read, or his book on St. Francis and so on. But when Kazantzakis did a book, now here's an artist for you. For instance, he did that book, The Last Temptation of Jesus. You know how he did this book? He went to Palestine first for 3 years. And he tried to walk every road that Jesus walked. He stayed in the desert for 40 days, and he worked himself to the very edge of a nervous breakdown. Then he sequestered himself in a hotel room in Jerusalem for 6 weeks. And he wrote this book. And when he was finished, he was burnt out for 2 years. It just took every ounce of strength. He just got completely into this book and so on. See, that's an artist working. He brought himself to the edge of a nervous breakdown with every book that he wrote. And in fact, he did have a nervous breakdown. He was trying to write a book on Nietzsche, and he had a nervous breakdown before he could write the book and so on. See, but he gave himself to the creative process. Or to my mind, one of the great, great writers of the last century, British, Doris Lessing. Powerful writer, okay? But you read her memoirs and so on. Doris Lessing, as a writer, she would simply submit herself to different experiences. So at one time, she checked herself into a psychiatric clinic and sat for days and banged her head against the wall to see what that's like. Okay. Then you can write a novel, you can write a book, and so on, Doris Lessing said you don't write great novels by sitting and looking at a serene river and this is Lake Ontario and so on, where you're going to write a little love poem or something, You want a novel about depth and darkness and going crazy and stuff, try it first, And see, so artists, perennially, and sometimes it's almost coordinated to the degree that they're great artists, to that degree, they're letting their sanity slip, And see, those of us in this room here, most of us, we have a pretty good grip on our sanity. And that's good. So you're not psychotic and so on. Well, none of us have written a great novel either. See, Nouwen didn't always have a great grip on his sanity, but he wrote powerful, deep books. See, artists pay the price. It's the same with a lot of these rock musicians and so on. Okay, that's the first thing. So the struggle for normal and balance, it's true for us too. All of us, we struggle, but a friend of mine who'd like to be a writer, and he says, my problem, he says, I'm just too pathologically rooted and sane. And he said, I'm a Saskatchewan farm kid, and what the hell, I'm not Doris Lessing or Kazantzakis. No, he has a wonderful, robust sanity. He's not a great artist. And oftentimes, artists don't have a wonderful, robust sanity. They struggle with that. Nouwen didn't have a wonderful, robust sanity. He had a powerfully deep soul and mind. Okay, but he paid a price, sometimes going there. Then secondly, the struggle to find an equilibrium between inflation and depression. A person who's really helped elucidate for me, you want to read a person whom I quoted yesterday, Robert L. Moore, or I think I quoted him yesterday, maybe I didn't. He's in Chicago. He's a Jungian, but also a philosopher, anthropologist. And he spent a lot of his life work is really on the struggle between depression and inflation. And Moore's thesis is quite simple and quite accurate and deep. Again, it comes from, he's a Christian. Actually, he's a Methodist married to a Roman Catholic. And he says, you're born, and your deepest thing is your image and likeness of God. But the problem with that is that's a powerful energy. And Moore says, okay, I want to look at this room. Remember the first time I ever heard him speak? It was in a lecture hall at the University of San Francisco. And he came in on a Friday night and he says, well, he said, if you're here and you're over 25 years old, he says, there's a pretty good chance that you're living in chronic depression. He said, not clinical depression, chronic depression. He said, and that's good. He said, because most people who aren't living in chronic depression, he said, are jerks. He said, and you wish to hell they were living in chronic depression, And he said, that's all we're going to talk about this weekend is how do you find that balance? See, most sensitive people, you're so afraid of being a jerk. You're so afraid of somebody saying, God, she's full of herself. He's so full of himself that you'd much sooner be depressed. We put a cap on our energy. Notice John Paul and Mother Teresa didn't put a cap on their energy at all. And they were never depressed, Mother Teresa had deep, dark nights. She was never depressed. She filled a room like a heater, like a light bulb. Coming into the room just brought energy into a room. Deep down, she was struggling with, but there was never any psychological depression, See, but most of us, we're so afraid of this energy that what happens is we cap it. We turn on our cooling jets like should have gone on in Chernobyl, and we sizzle. It's called an adaptive depression. We're depressed because our own energy is being suppressed almost all the time. Now, what often happens in artists, and you saw Henri Nouwen describing that, is that they go up and down. Remember you saw the little video where he gave the talk in the Crystal Cathedral with his chart, And he says, then you get affirmation, you're way up, and then this happens, you're way down, then your success, you're way up, and then you're way down. See, they get these powerful vacillations of depression and inflation and so on. Now, I'm going to give you an example, and this is a little bit of a risk, but the illustrations are helpful. When I was studying in Belgium, I did my doctorate there, and I think I can say this, that the professor I had in my whole life, and I've been to many universities and so on and sat in many lectures, who I thought brought the most energy ever into a room was the Belgian theologian Christiane Brusselmans. There was a radiant energy that came from her. I remember the first time I went to class with her, and I just sat kind of spellbound, and afterwards I went over and I said, Christiane, I says, you're wonderful. I said, I've never heard a lecture like that ever. She burst out crying. I said, you must hear this all the time. She said, I hear it all. See, Henri Nouwen was like this, See, Nouwen could go on a stage and he could absolutely channel energy. I saw him on that stage in Winnipeg, and these poor people, they didn't even know who was there. They said, wow, and he sat there without a note. He just sat there, with that way he had his sweater on his shoulder all the time, that Nouwen look with his glasses. And he was in Winnipeg handling a deep depression, writing the book, The Inner Voice of Love, and he just electrified him on the stage, and he got off the stage, and he was depressed, and so on. See, that's the struggle of the artist. It's not unique to Henri Nouwen. Incidentally, Christiane Brusselmans, you know how she ended? She ended up killing herself. She ended up throwing herself in front of a train. This is one of the most gracious, energy-filled, wonderful people I've ever met in my whole life. But she was so finely attuned to energy and love and so on, that at a certain point, some of these people are too bruised to be touched. They're too bruised to touch anything. See, it's their very sensitivity and so on. And now, I'm using other examples. So he said, Henri wasn't unique. I don't know rock stars in the rock world. I read about them. You watch a movie on Amy Winehouse and people like that. And so on. Those are artists who are they're so finely tuned to energy that many of them just die. Janis Joplin, who said this, you know what it's like to make love to 20,000 people and then go home and try to sleep alone. She ended up dying at age 27, like Michael Jackson. Not by suicide, but simply at a certain point they can't eat normally anymore, they can't sleep normally anymore, they try to live on drugs and painkillers and so on, and eventually we die. Nouwen, to his credit, always was able to handle that, handle with great difficulty, checked himself in the clinic sometimes, but, he died of a heart attack. He didn't die of a drug overdose or anything, and so on. But you understand that this is a struggle. First of all, again, it's a struggle for all of us, but it's just much more deeply. Artists have a heightened, this energy is heightened inside of them. And you see the third thing, the struggle with inflamed energy, with what I call overstimulated grandiosity. This is exactly what Janis Joplin is naming in that little anecdote I gave you, which she says, do you have any idea what it's like to make love to 20,000 people and drink in that kind of adulation and then go home and try to sleep alone or try to sleep at all? Okay, now, what happens is, with all of us, is when we are affirmed, we're drinking in powerful energy. And you can't protect yourself against that. The same as when you are rejected, you are taking in powerful energy, and you can't pretend that this isn't affecting you. We were talking at lunch, and we're saying that, the biggest struggle in seminary programs today, and when I was in seminary too, when I was in the seminary, there's no offense to my seminary professors. I had very, very good seminary professors and formation directors. And they taught us theology, they taught us scripture, they even taught us psychology, and they taught us how to minister to people. But they didn't tell us what's going to happen to us when we're ministering to people. When you're ministering to others, or just interacting with others all the time, something's happening to you. You are either drinking in affirmation or you're drinking in rejection. You're either drinking in warmth or coldness all the time, and that's affecting you. You can't pretend. Imagine you're a priest and you finish Mass, and a whole bunch of people come and say, Father, you were wonderful. This was just wonderful. You can't protect yourself against that. That's going to overstimulate your grandiosity. Or vice versa. Someone looks at you and says, you stunk. God, you were awful. Why are you preaching? You can't pretend that doesn't hurt you. You can't pretend that didn't penetrate. It'll sting. And how will you handle that? See, one inflates, the other depresses. And it's happening all the time. Except to the artist, it happens in big ways. Henri Nouwen was selling millions of books. He was getting an invitation to speak every day. He was being adulated by people that affected him. He was also experiencing rejection, and that experience, at Harvard, and the jealousy of his colleagues, and he was oversensitive in a room. If you looked at Henri Nouwen, even a little bit cold, he drank it in. you know, somehow I don't feel welcome here, you know, depression, inflation, and so on. It's tiring, it wears down, but also it makes you prone to a lot of obsessions. And artists struggle with that. We all do. I want to give you a little quote here. It's interesting. John of the Cross. John of the Cross, I think one of the great mystics who ever wrote. And John of the Cross said, at one point, several times, he has this little cryptic thing when he throws in. He says, as you grow in the spiritual life, he said, the deeper you grow, he said, at a certain point, he said, the spirit begins to flow from the soul into the senses. That's quite a thing, he says. The spirit begins to flow from the soul into the senses. What's he saying? Well, this, you know, it begins to affect you, you know, the not just the sexuality, but the eros. The eros is a much wider thing than sexuality. That fire of God, it begins to get into your senses, in your body, in your sexuality. You begin to feel this. You know, we've always been so tame in the church to try to name this stuff, and in all the churches. That's why it's no accident that so many famous evangelists and stuff fall through sex. You know, Jimmy Swaggart and Jimmy Baker and all, and we should feel sorry for them, you know. See, that goes with the territory. The spirit, it wasn't that they were insincere. It's not that these are bad people and so on. It's, you know, they're like Henri Nouwen. At a certain point, they're struggling. The spirit begins to flow into the senses. Unless you're really grounded or have somebody to ground you, you are just going to struggle at a very deep level. And you're going to struggle with your sexuality. You're going to struggle with professional misconduct. You're going to struggle with manipulation and so on. And if you're a celibate like Nouwen, who's struggling and is true to his celibacy, you're going to struggle with some powerful obsessions that are sometimes going to drive you into clinics, you know. I'm sorry if this stuff is strong. I'm trying to name this in a safe way. This isn't just about Henri Nouwen. This is just the way it works, okay? And then lastly, if I haven't said too much already, okay, the struggle that lies in the innate connection between creativity and sexuality. You know, it's no accident we create babies through sex. But sexuality is deeply tied to your creativity, and creativity is deeply tied to sexuality. So you get a Henri Nouwen who's a vowed celibate and a faithful celibate. It's going to cause some, and somebody with at that level of sensitivity, it's going to cause some major struggles. You know, we shouldn't be naive about that. I had a very close friend who left the priesthood. Wonderful, wonderful man, and very dedicated. And at one point he said, and he's a very creative man. He says, I can't do this anymore. He said, I simply cannot be a creative person without sex. He said, I can't do it, you know. Left the priesthood, you know. It was an honest decision on his part, much better than that than be there and live a double life or something, and so on. But see, sexuality and creativity, there's an innate connection. Like I said, it's not just metaphorical that babies are created by sex. Creativity, you know. And, you know, we dare I say this, we've never had the nerve, some mystics have, to draw out sexuality inside of God. You know, Hildegard of Bingen and some of these German mystics, they wrote stuff that we should be reading, you know. For instance, you know what, let's just give you one example. You know, you're reading on Ash Wednesday, you know, the priest puts dust on your head or ashes, said, you know, remember, dust thou art, and into dust thou shalt return. Now, that sounds ominous. Because when we think of dust, we think of the dust of the grave, or those little things that roll under your bed, you know, that you have to sweep up and so on. So you came out of dust and you're going back to dust. No, we came out of God's fertility. Hildegard of Bingen said, we came out of God's wetness, out of God's sex. With all that creativity that has created this universe and all these billions of universes and so on, that there's quite some dynamism happening here. We're going back into that. You're not becoming a little thing that rolls under your bed, you know. Okay. Now, artists, you know, they intuit that. They feel that. It's in their senses and so on. And that's why sometimes they're just jumping out of their skin. Now when I was jumping out of his skin, a whole lot. And if you're a Catholic celibate, it's a problem. But I remember I gave you that if you're not a celibate and you're Paul Tillich, he said, maybe I should have been a celibate. he said, I shouldn't have gotten married. He said, because I am jumping out of my skin and so on. See, creative people will struggle with that. We all struggle with that, if we're honest. But see, again, these 4 things I named, they're heightened. And sometimes the more creative the artist, the more those tensions are heightened inside the artist. And, that's Henri Nouwen, okay? And it's not that there was something psychologically wrong with him or whatever. I mean, we all have our psychological wounds and so on. We bear our parents didn't love us perfectly, and no parent ever did, and so on. But Henri Nouwen was the loved child. He said that, and so on. So it wasn't that he came from a dysfunctional home. He just had, he was an artist. He was a faith-filled artist, genius, and this stuff was torturing him. It was anguishing him. But from that, also, he had enough courage to go into it, and from that came his depth. Now, the next part I just want to name. The special tensions within the artist, those highly in tune with their creativity. The first one I want to talk about a little bit. There'll be a struggle to not identify with that energy. See, that's the struggle with a lot of rock stars, athletes, creative people, and so on, or famous writers and so on. The danger is that they identify with the energy, Whereas somebody like Mother Teresa, notice Mother Teresa never identified with the energy. Mother Teresa was one powerful God instrument on this planet. But remember, she said, it's not me. I'm a humble little woman. This is all about God. Not all rock stars have Mother Teresa. They don't always say, this is not about me. Okay. A lot of times, it is about me, and then that energy will kill you. That energy will kill you in one way or the other, either through inflation or depression or some combination of. And then for many, it wasn't for Nouwen, but for many artists, there's a deep struggle with faith. So, and that's not an accident. C.S. Lewis, the great apologist, wrote most eloquently on that. If you read, for instance, his fine little book called The Great Divorce, where he talks about the struggle of the artist and the intellectual with faith. Why does the artist struggle so much with faith? Because they're so close to beauty that they think earthly beauty is the end. Somebody with less artistic sense actually has a break in terms of faith. Or the same with the intellectual. They struggle because precisely, see, God is one, true, good, and beautiful. Transcendental properties of God. See, and people are highly attuned to beauty, to truth, and so on. Oftentimes, ironically, struggle with God because they think it's here. They can't do that extra step. They mistake the icon for the reality, and they end up with an idol. And then the struggle with sexuality, we talked about that. The struggle with obsessions and addictions. See, if you're highly attuned and so on, because remember, the image and likeness of God, you have godly appetites. The alcoholic, you can analyze this through addictions. See, an alcoholic doesn't want to drink a glass of scotch. They would drink all the scotch in the whole world. You're driven to that because God can. The sex addict wants to sleep with everybody on the whole planet, not just one person. See, these are godly appetites, and they come from the image and likeness of God. It's divine energy, and if it's not contained, if it's not disciplined, incidentally, the word discipleship comes from what? It comes from the word discipline. So the disciple puts himself or herself under a discipline. They can will the one thing. Nouwen struggled, not on the essential level. Nouwen, that's why he was a saint. He was true to his vows. He was true to who he was. But he struggled at a psychological level really deeply with that. Remember the quote I gave you yesterday? He said, I want to be a saint, but I also want to experience all the sensations that sinners experience. I want to have a deep life of prayer, but I don't want to miss anything on this planet, and so on. Okay. Then, struggle with pathological disquiet, the struggle with normality, and also this wasn't, I don't think, a thing for Nouwen, But a lot of artists also struggle with suicidal tendencies. That's not a secret. Now, I want to give you just a brief example of both in Nouwen, and then I want to conclude with the gift that was Henri Nouwen from his life. See, Nouwen, it's no secret that his books came out of that. So Nouwen, and during his life, he struggled with obsessions. I don't know all the details, but every once in a while, Nouwen would be in a clinic where he'd be dealing with just an obsessional neuroses that he couldn't function anymore, you know. See, that was his struggle. But from that, I'm going to quote you from this book in a few minutes, he wrote, I think, the deepest book he ever wrote, you know, where he's able to touch that darkness and then write out of that darkness. And then his struggle in life to will the one thing, you know, that he was always this bundle of contradictions, you know. I'm going to take care of Adam, but I'm going to rush it so I can write. I'm going to go to a monastery, but I'm going to struggle like heck to be in solitude, and on and on. You know, he always struggled to will the one thing. He said, not that I don't want the one thing, we want everything. Okay. Now, when you bring that all together, you get an anguished genius that was four things. You know, when someone says, you make an icon of Henri Nouwen, what do you want to picture there? First of all, he was a wounded healer. So he was a great healer. All of us are in this room today because he touched us. He's healed parts in us by taking his own wound. See, so he was this wounded, genius, faith-filled artist, and he took that wound, and it became a source that speaks to us, you know. So he, of all people, was the right person to write the book, The Wounded Healer. He knew the theory, and he did the practice. So much, as I said yesterday, of Henri Nouwen's power to touch our lives come from his articulation of his own woundedness, okay? Complete with the next thing, you know. He was a clinical psychologist and a highly trained one, but that's not where his power came from. He was a wounded healer. His power came. He was a natural mystic. He was a natural mystic. See, and mystics, what's the difference between mysticism and mystic? You know, these are two very misunderstood words because we've made them exotic words. When I was teaching in Edmonton, one year I was teaching a course in mysticism, and the first night, it was a night course. I went around and said, why are you taking this course? And we got different answers. One woman said, I'm taking this course because I'm majoring in whatever's taught Monday nights. So it's the night I can be free, you know. Some seminary said, I didn't want to take it. My spiritual director has demanded I take this course. Okay. One woman said, because I'm a practicing mystic. Well, that raised a few eyebrows. Okay. Can you be a practicing mystic? Yes, absolutely, you know. In fact, we all are. Most of us are not very good at it, you know. See, mystic is to mysticism what an artist is to aesthetics. So, for instance, all of us have deep aesthetic experiences that move you to in the core of your soul. You look at beauty and get tears in your eyes, or you know, you're listening to this music and it just deeply moves your soul and so on. See, that's an aesthetic experience, you know. Or you're at your daughter's wedding and you're filled with all these feelings, you know. Those are deep aesthetic feelings, but you can't write the great novel about it, you know. You know, Iris Murdoch can, Doris Lessing could, and so on. See, they could give expression to what we feel but can't express. See, that's what writers do. That's what artists do. In fact, Iris Murdoch, a great line, Iris Murdoch says, the deepest pain you have, this says, art also has its martyrs. She said, and the deepest human pain of all is the pain of inadequate self-expression. It's quite a line. The deepest pain of all is the pain of inadequate self-expression. She's saying this, you know, inside of you, there's an opera, there's a novel, there's a painting, there's a beautiful piece of music, but most of us can't do it. So we try. We paint by numbers or paint. So I'm a practicing artist. I'm working paint by numbers. I'm not very good at it, you know. But Picasso was real good at it. But the same with spiritual writing. There's thousands of spiritual writers. All of them are mystics. You're trying to give expression to, see, we all have mystical experiences. And mystical experiences aren't necessarily extraordinary experiences, where you have a vision or whatever, They're intuitions. They're just a sense and so on. See, and what mystics can do is they can express that. Nouwen, along with Merton and some others, were powerful mystics because they can take things that we're all experiencing but can't articulate, and they give them articulation, and it lays it out. This morning, Gabriel gave a great quote here, and I hope I get this right, where Nouwen says, I'm trying to give words to what lies under the threshold of human consciousness. That's a good definition of mysticism. You try to give words to what lies under the threshold of human consciousness. See, we're feeling it, but he gives it expression, And so Nouwen was a natural mystic. So his consciousness was highly attuned, very sensitive, and so on. See, and then he was able to give expression to that, and that's what made him a great spiritual writer. He was a wounded healer, he was a mystic, and he was also a saint. Now, I don't say that lightly, Nouwen himself always used to say, to be a saint is to will the one thing. Gets that from Kierkegaard. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to do it easily, and it doesn't mean you're going to do it perfectly. It means you're going to do it with great struggle, and it means you're going to do it essentially. See, Nouwen's life always had some mess in it. There was always, and as we discovered afterwards, even with Mother Teresa, whose life looked like Mother Teresa, just cakewalked through life. Afterwards, they published her diaries, and they found out she lived with a deep, dark night of the soul for 60 years of her life and suffered deep interior anguish and so on. She wasn't cakewalking through life and so on. She was also struggling at a very deep level. See, Nouwen struggled at a very deep level. He struggled with obsessions that drove him into clinics. He struggled with all kinds of, where he'd feel rejected and so on. But he was always lived essential fidelity. He lived in his own words. Remember, his mentor was always, you have to live as God's beloved. Always, I'm God's beloved. He was essentially faithful to his vows. He was very faithful to his priesthood. He was faithful to his vocation. And he couldn't always do it perfectly. For years he tried for downward mobility. Didn't always quite get down. But he was always heading in the right direction. Thomas Aquinas, the great philosopher, Thomas Aquinas says, you reach union with something in two ways. You can reach union in something in actual fact and completeness. You can also reach union with something or somebody in desire. See, Nouwen's desire was not messy, his essential desires and so on. And he was able to integrate his full humanity and his priesthood and his celibacy into his struggle and then give us an essential fidelity. He's my kind of saint, because he's a saint you can relate to. Here's a saint who struggled. Here's a saint who, it wasn't an easy walk. It's interesting, Mother Teresa turns out also struggled, but we never got that indication. Everybody kind of thought, well, Mother Teresa, she just cakewalks through life. She walks on water and so on. In fact, my brother has a little quip. He says, if you want the definition of religious fear, he said, you've died and you're before the pearly gates and Mother Teresa's in front of you, and St. Peter says to her, now you didn't do very well. Okay. Well, I hope when I'm there that Nouwen's in front of me, or that Nouwen is handling the pearly gates, and they say, I know what it's like to struggle. Nouwen was a struggling saint, but he was a saint. And then lastly, he's a saint for our age. Ages need patron saints. It's interesting, I'm an oblate of Mary Immaculate, and our founder, Eugene de Masnon, was canonized in 1995, but he came from a very dysfunctional family. his father and mother, and it was 200 years ago, and divorce was unheard of, and that this bitter divorce and all kinds of things and so on. And when Pope John canonized him, he said, he's a saint for broken, dysfunctional families. So you want a saint. If your marriage is broken up and all kinds of stuff, well, you want our founder. See, Nouwen is a saint for our age. Why? Because we live in an age of overstimulated grandiosity and energy. Our kids are on cell phones all day, and they got stuff in each hand, and we're all overstimulated and over-informationed, and everybody's jumping out of their skin. You want a patron saint? You got one. Henri Nouwen, it's too bad he died before all this information technology. I'm sure Henri would have had about 6 things. He wouldn't know how to run any of them, but he'd have had them. And, see, if your kids want a patron saint, you're jumping out of your skin, you want a patron saint. He's a patron saint for our age. We're an overstimulated, we have too much of everything. We're just overwhelmed today, overwhelmed with complexity, overwhelmed with plurality, overwhelmed with everything and so on. Nouwen, and we're overstimulated. Nouwen is our saint. I want to end, and then we have a little time for some questions. Okay, but I want to give you, this is vintage Nouwen, and this is the last 2 pages. I'll just read you a paragraph of this book, The Inner Voice of Love, which he wrote in this deep depression. Now, this is Nouwen with his best thought, but also his wonderful language. I'm a writer. I can only envy somebody who can write like this. He says, the great challenge is living your wounds through instead of thinking them through. It is better to cry than to worry. It is better to feel your wounds deeply than to understand them. It's better to let them enter your silence than to talk about them. Yeah, great. This is great language, and it's great thinking. He said, it's better to cry than to worry. It's better to feel your wounds deeply than to understand them. It's better to let them enter into your silence than to talk about them. The choice you face constantly is whether you are taking your wounds to your head or to your heart. In your head, you can analyze your wounds, find their causes and consequences, coin some words to speak and write about them. But no final healing is likely to come from that. You need to let your wounds go deep into your heart. Then you can live them through, and you will discover that they do not destroy you. Your heart is greater than your wounds. That's mystical language. Now we have time for maybe 5-10 minutes if you have some questions or reactions and so on. And there's a mic back there.
Thanks. Did Henri ever get to a place of contentment in himself?
Well, that's a very good question. It's true for Henri and so on. Yes and no. See, we get to places of contentment, but they don't last. The same as, for instance, if I say to you, do we ever really have faith? Like, is faith, let me use faith and we use contentment. Is faith something we ever nail? So, I got faith. Faith doesn't work like that. Faith works this way. Some days you walk in water, and some days you sink like a stone. And the same with contentment. Some days you say, I'm there. The next day you're not there at all. See, Rumi, the Sufi mystic, has a great line. He says, we live with a deep secret that sometimes we know and then not, then we know it, then we don't know it. See, contentment isn't something you achieve. We will in heaven, But here on earth, it's contentment is something, in fact, Nouwen has some, let me quote Nouwen on this. Nouwen says, he said, we're not restful-filled people who occasionally, let me start this over. If I get the tapes right in my mind, I'll get this. Okay. Basically, he says your default, if I can use this expression, is restlessness and disquiet. He said, so you're not a restful person who occasionally gets restless. You're a restless person who occasionally finds rest. He said, you're not a person who lives in habitual intimacy who sometimes gets lonely. You're a lonely person who sometimes experiences intimacy. He said, we're not people who live in serene solitude who sometimes experience disquiet. We're disquieted people who sometimes experience solitude. See, so yes, he did sometimes experience contentment, but that's not the default. See, so normally Nouwen, and I'm going from his writings, he was a restless person, but sometimes he'd experience rest. He was lonely, sometimes he'd experience intimacy. He was a disquieted person who sometimes experienced solitude. A good question.
I don't mean this as a fake question or whatever, but it does strike me, we talked about God blessing us into becoming a prodigal and coming home and being received. And then we talk about Henry being a saint because he held faithful to his celibacy, and even though he had all these passions. Is there some, this question is hard to express, but is there some sense in which maybe it would be better for God to bless Henry into sexual promiscuity for a while? Like I'm trying to, as a spiritual director, for example, how do you offer to a person to accompany them in their life when they're struggling with either being celibate and faithful, but depressed and screwed up and hardly managing their life, or being blessed into whatever they have to face?
No, actually, thank you for the question. That's actually a very good question that, oftentimes we don't have the courage to ask, But I'm gonna come down on a very traditional Christian way here, not because it's a traditional Christian answer, because I deeply believe it, I would never counsel sexual promiscuity for that, because what it's going to do, first of all, it's going to fragment that person's sexual psyche further, See, sexual promiscuity is never an answer. So it's never, that would be a little bit akin to telling an alcoholic, go on a couple of binges, before we get you sober. It's just, no. I'll put it to you archetypally, but I deeply believe that. See, the deepest meaning of sexuality, you talked about home. See, Henry and I was always looking for home. The deepest meaning of sexuality, it's supposed to take you home. And if you aren't home, you shouldn't be having sex. Like let me just put this, I'm not trying to be crass with this, but say, what does a sexual promiscuous person do after he or she has sex? They go home. That's almost a joke. See, sex is supposed to be what takes you home. It's supposed to be your home. We need more poetics and stuff about the marriage bed. As there's a young author, he's not so young anymore, but out in New Jersey, called Christopher DeVink. And find and read a book of his called Precious Memories for a Faithless Time. And it's a story of his marriage. Now, I'll tell you, I read that book, and my last year in Saskatoon, I was teaching a course at the University of Saskatchewan, and a night course as an adjunct prof. And I had some pretty existential students in my class, and I assigned that book to them to read, And one young woman came to see me one day in the office and said, something, says, Father, that's the best book and most important book I've ever read. She was in her early 30s, and she said, I have slept my way through 2 provinces. She said, I was raised with no badge. She said, but what I want is what he has. She said, I cried when I read that book. She said, this is what you're yearning for, the marriage bed. She said, what he has with his wife. See, she was coming out of a sexuality that was fragmented through promiscuity, See, so as a counselor or something, I would never, ever counsel sexual promiscuity. It's kind of get it out of your system and so on. Because to me, it's akin to telling an alcoholic, just go out and go on some really good benders. We used to say that irrigates the problem, it doesn't solve the problem or eradicate the problem. But I mean, again, like I said, and I'm saying this not because it's the traditional Christian answer, and it is the traditional Christian answer. I deeply believe that, and when I've worked counseling people and so on, it's just, I will say, that's not a road to go down. It's going to create further, and incidentally, it is the road that a lot of the rock stars go down. And it doesn't lead to integration. It doesn't take the problem away.
We have time for one more question
Okay.
over here.
Okay.
And then we're going to have a Q&A at the end, so
Okay.
we'll have more time.
Okay, last question.
This is an answer to a question. I was able to be witness to Henry's absolute contentment in showing how he had been able to take care of Adam. It was the quietest I've ever seen him and the proudest. And I'm a nurse, and so it was like he was getting a star because, or mark, but he was incredibly content. That experience fed his soul.
Okay, great. And since we're talking about Henry as a saint, that'll be a great note to end it on. You saw him as a saint. Thank you.